Good morning. For those of you struggling to find a seat in this wonderfully well-attended research day, there are some still up at the front. Reminds me very much of church. My church actually roped off the back 4 pews to stop people from sitting there, and the complaints were so awful that they actually unroped them again. But there are certainly plenty of seats here. Well, a welcome to the University of Divinity's annual research day. This is my 4th, and it's beautifully turned out to be the biggest in this fantastically wonderful space at St. Athanasius College. Now, may I invite Frank Rees to come and provide our acknowledgement of country.
Thank you, John, and let me add my words of welcome to you. May I invite you to stand as we acknowledge country. As we begin, we acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand. We pay our respect to their elders past and present, and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. And we commit ourselves to continue to pray and work for reconciliation and justice. Thank you.
And now I'm delighted to invite His Grace Bishop Cyril and then Lisa Agaby to introduce us and welcome us to the building.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be with all of you this morning. I'm Bishop Cyril, the Dean of St. Athanasius College, and it gives me great joy and honor this morning to welcome you all to Eporo Tower. The word Eporo comes from a Coptic hymn, an ancient Coptic hymn, meaning the King of Peace. So we hope that this tower and our city campus is a place that promotes peace, tranquility, harmony amongst all people, and we encourage all of the community to come into our worship space on level 1, and we hope that that will be open to the public soon and everyone will be able to come for contemplation, for meditation, or just for some quiet time in the hustle and bustle of the busy Melbourne CBD. And I also welcome you this morning to our city campus of St. Athanasius College, which is on level 3. And if you do have time during the day, please do go up and have a look at our facilities there and the technology that's available there as well. But to welcome you all today at the annual research day for the University of Divinity, and for the first time to be hosted here, really is a great joy for all of my faculty and staff, and indeed for all of our students. So I hope you enjoy your day, and I hope that you have a lot of fruitful discussions. Unfortunately, I won't be able to be here because I'm currently doing a senior executive MBA at the Melbourne Business School, so I have to go back to my negotiations class shortly. But I really hope that it's a very fruitful and productive day for all of you. Lectures will the papers will take place on level 1 and level 2 and level 3. I'd like to hand over to Lisa for some housekeeping issues. But welcome again, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Your Grace. Okay, so just a few housekeeping things. Most importantly, food. So we will be having morning tea and lunch today, and they will both be in this room. So morning tea will be served at 10:40, and so just to make life easy for us, the caterers will actually come and put the food on the tables for us. So when you come in, just take a seat. Then lunch will be at 12:45. It will be self-serve buffets, so the food will be set up at the back of the room. There will be, vegan, vegetarian, and obviously just normal food, and everything will be clearly marked. Sorry, you know what I mean by normal food. Being Coptic, we fast 3/4 of the year, so we crave normal food most of the year. Okay, so if we can just ask though that after you finish your meals, if you can just help us by putting your crockery at the back of the on the buffet bar, just to help with cleaning up as well. Tea and coffee will be available in the foyer on level 2, just out here throughout the day. So just help yourself. Now, in regards to the bathrooms, there is a bathroom on each floor. So it is to the end of every floor and then to the left. Now, on level 2, though, you will actually have to pass through the classroom. I think it's classroom 7. Yeah, so you'll have to pass through classroom 7 to get into the bathroom. But basically, on every floor, it's right to the end and then left. Now, in regards to the stairwell, we will have the lifts open during the day, but if you do want to take the stairwell, we have put signs in the stairwell to help facilitate you going up and down. However, I've also put a sign on one of the stairwell doors that says "Do not enter. Please do not take that stairwell, or else you'll get stuck." So just take the stairwell that has the open door. Otherwise, keep your mobile in your pocket just in case you do get lost in the stairwell. Okay, so lectures will take place on this floor, which is level 2. There will be classrooms 6 and 7 on this floor, and then on level 1, which is the church floor, there will be lecture room 2. And then up on level 3, there will be lecture rooms 1, 3, 4 and 5. Now, the reason why there was a bit of a mix-up with the rooms and the reason why number 2 is actually on level 1 instead of level 3, we just had a slight hiccup with one of the lecture rooms on level 3 at the last minute, and that's why we had to relocate it to level 1. There is a mezzanine floor in between level 1 and 2, so if you are taking the stairs, just keep in mind that you will be walking or travelling an extra floor, so no need to get off at the mezzanine level. Okay, now in regards to Wi-Fi access, there will be notes passed around, I think, but if you open up your settings and you go to purple, you can access the Wi-Fi either by entering in your email or your Facebook account. So are there any questions at
Meg was at the back. Has she disappeared? Meg, could you give us a wave so everyone can see? That's Meg. For those of you who don't know. So this is not a day for administrative matters. Thank goodness. But to celebrate and peer test the terrific range and volume of research being done across the university. As academics, we cut our professional teeth on research training. And it's in our research-driven activities that we continue to have our raison d'etre. In and through our research, we perform our freedom to be truthful, We deepen our knowledge and our understanding with intellectual integrity. We learn to appreciate complexity, test perspectives, and competing ideas. In our research, we engage together as a learning community embarked on a common endeavour. So I hope that today will be a day that will be thoroughly enjoyable, but also one that will be intellectually challenging for you and especially stimulating. And now, as we head into our first plenary session, I'd like to invite Chris Monaghan, who's the president of Yarra Theological Union, to introduce our first speaker.
So good morning, everybody. As we gather today, we've got an exciting program, and no better way to start than with Reverend Dr. Robin Whittaker. So her doctoral research was in the area of ekphrasis, rhetoric and persuasion in the book of Revelation. So Robin today will be talking particularly about rhetoric and appeals to emotion, which is an important part of the book of Revelation and its purpose. So Robin would be well known to you. She did her doctorate at the University of Chicago in the book of Revelation, and has had subsequently her work has been published by Moa Seebeck. And most recently, she's very famous for being rated by The Conversation as one of the top 50 thinkers in Australia. So that's a great honour to Robin and to us as a university. So without more ado, I'd just like you to warmly welcome Robin for her talk today.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'll assume that you've all obviously reread the book of Revelation and memorised it for this paper, but I'll have bits of text on the screen. Seeing is believing, according to an old adage. It's an adage that points to the power of sight to persuade, to compel. Aristotle put it more like this: of all the senses, sight makes us know things. So let's go back into the ancient world and imagine that world. If you walked up the hill in ancient Pergamum, you would have encountered a plethora of material images that communicated the religious views, the mythic tales, and the political claims that shaped the culture of the 1st century CE. You might have passed a temple dedicated to the goddess Roma and the Emperor Augustus, a temple of Athena, a massive theatre, a renowned library which housed not just texts but numerous statues, an altar to Zeus, and perhaps by the time John writes, the beginnings of a temple to Trajan. While certainly an excellent example of imperial and cultic architecture, Pergamum was not entirely unusual in Asia Minor, for the presence of cultic sites and government buildings replete with statues of gods, benefactors, and rulers. This is the context into which John, the author of Revelation, writes to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. And his challenge, I'm suggesting to you today, is how to convince his hearers of God's reality and presence. He has to compete in this marketplace of visually constructed ideology to persuade Christians to give allegiance to God alone. The problem is that he's a Jew. and he's inherited an iconic religious tradition. He cannot compete by making his own colossal statue, nor point to any material presence of Yahweh. After all, the temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed, and perhaps with it, any sense of the divine presence in the land. So how do you make God real to those who think God might be absent, or God has abandoned them, or lacks power and has been defeated? Well, you turn to something better than images: words. In 1984, George Kennedy published New Testament Interpretation Through Rhetorical Criticism, which represented one of the first attempts at providing a methodology for biblical scholars engaging in rhetorical criticism. Now, this book includes chapters on various classical rhetorical techniques, and it addresses the Gospels, Acts, and Pauline letters. But no mention was made of Revelation, nor was that text addressed, barring this one short sentence in the introduction. Ekphrasis, a vivid portrayal of a scene, well describes some of the visions in the Apocalypse. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. And we'll proceed in 3 parts. I'm going to give you a brief overview of ekphrasis, what it is, how it worked. If you're familiar with that literature, you can take a 5-minute nap. We'll then move on to looking at the opening epiphany in Revelation, and then broaden our view back up to the ancient world to talk about ekphrasis and divine representation in the 1st century. When it comes to ekphrasis, or vivid description, we have 2 main sources. The progymnasmata, which are the early exercises, the Greek textbooks outlining exercises for prose, composition and rhetoric, and we know these were used widely in the ancient school system. And then we have actual texts, speeches, writings, including the Greek novels, which offer a more complete picture of the way ekphrasis was used. But in the progymnasmata, these early exercises, ekphrasis is defined as follows: descriptive language, leading what is revealed vividly before the eyes. Vividness is important here, but so is the sense of movement. There's a sense that an ekphrasis, a vivid description, takes you on a journey. It's like parading something before your eyes. And according to the progymnasmata, there are 3 distinguishing features of an ekphrasis. There is vividness, there's saphoneia or clarity, and there's style that's appropriate for the subject matter. But to these 3, I would add 2 more from having surveyed examples in antiquity. An ekphrasis needs to have verisimilitude, that is, believability, plausibility. It needs to use images and symbols that are familiar and believable. And it needs to have, or it does have, language that emphasises the visual sense. These 5 traits are then usually combined in a narrative framework. When I began this research some years ago, there were very few scholars who'd written about ekphrasis and the New Testament. And when they did so, they tended to define ekphrasis in the way art historians do, and this might be the definition that's more familiar to you, which is words that describe something visual. So usually words that describe an actual painting or an actual statue. But this is a confusion of subject and effect. Ekphrasis mimics the effect of visual art. That is, it mimics seeing. But the subject matter of an ekphrasis can be vast. In the ancient world, they were used to describe people, places, times, and events, which is basically a way of saying anything. In the progymnasmata themselves, we have examples that are cited of people, of animals, of siege engines, of battles. Ancient men loved battles. A Peloponnesian wall known for its defensive properties, And there is one example that is of an artwork, which is Homer's Shield of Achilles. So Homer's description of the Shield of Achilles. And that would come to dominate ancient discussions. But if we look beyond the progymnasmata to actual usage, we see that ekphrasis was used widely to include deities, visions, the supernatural, and epiphanic experience. And this is what I'm more interested in. The goal, rhetorically, is to rouse emotions. It's not simply to be clever or poetic or beautiful in your writing style. So let's look at a couple of examples. I could describe the sack of a city in a kind of reporting type way. The city of such and such was sacked. You'd be like, interesting, great. Or you could be like Demosthenes. Nope, we're going to skip that. Who did this in a speech in a forensic setting describing the city of Phocis. And he writes, "Not long ago when we were travelling to Delphi, necessity compelled us to look upon all these things. Homes razed to the ground, walls stripped away, a countryside bereft of its youth." I mean, he's laying it on thick here. "Only women, a few children, and pitiable old men. No one was able to express in words the evils that exist in that country today. And yet these are the people, I hear all of you, who openly cast their vote against the Thebans," etc., etc. So Demosthenes here is describing the sacking of this city in such a way that it appeals to the emotions and allows him to make a broader appeal in this courtroom scene. The problem is measuring the success of an ekphrasis. Because if the success is about how it works on your emotions, that is necessarily subjective. It's not, however, entirely impossible, because we know in the ancient world that the rousing and the creation of desired emotions in one's hearers was the topic of many ancient rhetoricians. So let's have a look now at an ekphrasis of a deity, and this is the vision of Isis in Apuleius's Golden Ass, or Metamorphosis. This comes from the second last scene in a tale that is a story really of transformation of a man into a donkey or ass and back again. Now, having purified himself by bathing 7 times in the ocean and praying to the Queen of Heaven for salvation from his state as an embodied ass, Lucius in the story is granted a vision of Isis while he sleeps. The experience is so overwhelming that Lucius frankly asserts he can only merely attempt to describe her marvellous appearance, while simultaneously noting the limitations of human speech to do so. You might have noticed Demosthenes does this as well, that there are no words, even though they're clearly using words quite skillfully. In the Lucius story, the goddess herself is actually credited with having provided the necessary language and rhetorical skill. This is a little bit of the vision, and I won't read it all, but it's an excellent non-biblical example of an ekphrasis of a deity. And all the hallmarks of ekphrasis are present: a vivid description. The scene is introduced with visual language, and even Lucius's plea to the goddess is framed in terms of sight. Restore me to the sight of my people. He wants to be seen, and he will end up being seen and actually functioning as a kind of icon in the text. But in addition to the visual language, we have descriptive terms that make the scene more vivid. The snakes are rearing, the colour red is flaming, her cloak is gleaming, the stars are glittering. Such description makes the inanimate decorations of her dress seem alive. She is a moving, glittering, fragrant, auditory, multicoloured spectacle. But in many ways, she's not a new spectacle. She's profoundly recognisable because all of these images are heavily dependent on traditional depictions of Isis, both in statuary and literature. And for a quick point of comparison, we can see some of the same traits here in the way Lucian describes the goddess Hera. These epiphanic texts, like the Book of Revelation, raise important questions about human representations of the sacred and of epiphanic encounter. Within Apuleius' story, Lucius seeks the goddess's presence and performs ritual actions in the hope of communicating with the divine. But for the reader, it's the author's skill that brings her to life through his wordcraft. He makes her manifest to both Lucius and the reader. We, the readers, are likewise invited to gaze upon Isis's dazzling form, and we too are liable to be astonished. Are we astonished by the epiphanic encounter, or amazed by the author's poetic skillfulness? Perhaps both. Ekphrasis' particularly vivid description of a deity bridges the gap between word and image to create a means of accessing the divine. So let's turn now to the second section and have a look at the Book of Revelation. The vision of one like a son of man in chapter 1, verses 9 to 20, forms part of John's commissioning and is the first vision proper in the Book of Revelation. At the core of it is an epiphany of a divine-like creature, one like a son of man, and an account of John's own response and interaction with that creature. Now, in addition to establishing John's ethos, the description in 1:9 presents the entire vision as a form of testimony, of martyria. And it's noteworthy in Revelation that the testimony, in fact, the entire apocalypse is Jesus's, you know what I mean? It's not John's. It's the apocalypse to John that is Jesus. So testimony frames the entire book, from the opening sentences right through to chapter 22, where it's repeated. In rhetorical forensic terms, this means that John is not self-testifying, an act which lacks credibility, but he's bearing witness to the testimony of another, that is Jesus. And by framing the entire narrative in such a way, John establishes his visions as ocular proofs and himself as an eyewitness to the divine. Now, this forensic language that comes from the courtroom highlights the association between testimony and vivid description in the ancient world. Kathy Eden writes the following about ancient forensic oratory. Because in most legal cases, demonstrative evidence was unavailable, and she's pointing here to a pre-modern era where there's no DNA, there's no fingerprints, so how do you win a court case? Testimony provided the most common form of proof. Without first-hand knowledge of the act in question and faced with the need to reconstruct events, the jury had to rely on the detailed narration of the litigants and their witnesses. Consequently, the narrator, whether witness or litigant, set out to reproduce the vividness of ocular proof through language. The explicit use of energeia, or vividness, in legal context is demonstrated as we might expect in Attic oratory. So in Revelation, we have the framing of the very visions of the divine as a form of proof. John here is building a case, a persuasive case for his audience. In the absence of physical evidence, as we've said, of no temple or statue of the divine, John is relying upon vivid description of an epiphany as his proof for God's presence and God's impending action in the world. And as such, this opening vision forms a core part of his rhetorical argument. The vision starts with a sound that grabs his attention, divine presence is marked by a trumpet and a verbal commission. It's noteworthy that the very commission of John in this book is framed in a visual sense. Write what you see. Now, John describes his book as a prophecy, but here he actually departs from the prophetic tradition, which normally emphasizes write what you hear, speak the words of God, hear the words of God. This is write what you see. When the seer turns to hear the voice, his gaze rests upon golden lampstands rather than a person. We'll come back to the importance of these lampstands, but for now we follow his gaze as it zooms in on the figure described as one like a son of man in verse 13. This human divine figure wears a long robe and a golden sash as he stands amongst the lampstands, which almost seem forgotten in the detailed description that follows. Now, much of the language of Revelation is familiar from the Hebrew Bible, and the density might therefore seem normal, but it's not. When we compare this passage with its precursors in Daniel, Ezekiel, and others, we see that John has actually increased the density of descriptive details. He's also used this comparative particle throughout, hos and homoios. His hair is not just white, but white like snow. Eyes are like flaming fire. Feet are like burnished bronze. Small details allow the hearer to picture this rather amazing scene. 7 stars are held in his right hand, and the sword is not only two-edged, but sharp, an adjective that adds to its menace. And the Son of Man's face shines like the sun. However, John emphasises the danger of this by adding in its full force. The surfeit of images makes this scene dazzling. There's a visual version of it. Now, these dazzling symbols would not be the least bit convincing if they did not carry a sense of verisimilitude. It's no surprise then that John borrows these images both from the Hebrew Bible and from the Greco-Roman world. Light, cosmic symbols, priestly garments are all associated with the appearance of deities. But unusually, John here introduces 2 unfamiliar images as well, juxtaposing the new and the old, the coded and the decoded. The 2 most unusual symbols are the lampstands and the stars. They don't have a sort of a biblical precedence. Plus, both of these symbols, the lampstands and the stars, are accompanied by a verbal interpretation, drawing the hearer's attention to them particularly and highlighting their importance. Notably, the interpretation of them is offered right at the very end of the passage in verse 20, after the hearer has been left to puzzle over their meaning and their presence, thus creating an interpretive space, a typical technique in ekphrasis according to Shadi Bach. As we expect in such viewing, interpretation is offered by a figure of authority. In this case, the exalted Christ himself explains the mystery of what John has seen, stating specifically that the lampstands are the 7 churches of Asia Minor. The stars in the right hand have been, scholars have long pointed out several possible references, including this rather wonderful coin of Domitian's son from the 80s CE that also has 7 stars as a symbol of kind of royal and cosmic power. But in the text itself, the stars are interpreted as also associated with the 7 churches. They are the 7 angels or messengers of those churches. Therefore, both of the unusual, puzzling symbols point to those 7 congregations. And as Caird notes, it's of utmost importance for John's theology that the first statement he makes about the heavenly Christ is that he sees him among the lamps. That is, he sees him among the congregations. Now, John's response to this vision is to fall at the feet of Christ as though dead. An emotional response, and one that the text emphasises in a variety of ways, is a posture of fear. He's restored by a gesture of touch from this Son of Man, saying, "Do not fear." In ekphrastic literature, the emotional response within the scene is a way to signify to us as hearers and readers how we are to respond. So why introduce this emotion here? Why fear? According to Aristotle, fear is one of the most effective ways of motivating people and persuading them of a certain course of action. But fear only works on an audience if they believe the cause of that fear is threatening them personally or is in close proximity. So if I say to you, your house is going to be burgled sometime, you'll be like, yeah, okay. If I say, there's burglars at the door right now, you might be a little more fearful. Aristotle puts it in a slightly more sophisticated way than that. But talking about fear being defined as a troubled feeling caused by the imagination of an imminent evil. People do not fear all evils, but if you go to the third last line, only if they appear to be not far off, but near at hand. People do not fear things that are very remote. So to summarise this section, the introduction of new and unusual images in the epiphanic vision of Revelation 1, these stars and lampstands, not only create a space for hearers to engage and puzzle and participate in the vision, but they emphasise that this divine presence is right in their very midst. It sets up the letters that follow. God is near, God is somewhat terrifying, and they are right to be afraid. We move on to the third section. Now, this notion of ekphrasis or vivid description in the ancient world relies on the Stoic notion of fantasia or imagination. Writing specifically about ancient descriptions of art, Yash Elsner argues that an image communicated through vivid description gave the hearer the same access to the original as the artist himself. The same access. By original, Elsner here means the artist's imagined conception of something, not the product. So, if we think of a statue of Zeus, for example, viewing Zeus potentially grants the hearer access, or hearing an ekphrasis of Zeus potentially grants the hearer access not just to the actual statue it describes, but also to the artist's mental image. Imagination then allows one direct contact with the divine, albeit mediated through an artist's image or a writer's words. Verity Platt puts it this way: fantasia is thus represented as the ultimate form of theoria, that is, of knowledge or sight of true beauty, the power of the mind itself to visualise and communicate with God. Now, several ancient authors reflected on the nature of imagination, of fantasia, and its importance for accessing the divine. And when they did so, I'm not going to go into that, but when they did so, they often compared plastic art, material art, and poetry for their respective abilities to depict the divine. You have an example here from Philostratus's Life of Apollonius, who writes, and he's referring to that image of Zeus I just showed you, "Cities as beautiful as this are like the statue of Zeus, the one in Olympia made by Phidias, for it is seated where the Creator expected." Starts off well, positive affirmation there. "But men go everywhere, not unlike Homer's Zeus." who was made by Homer to appear in many forms and so is more marvellous than the one composed of ivory. For the one is visible on earth, but the other can be conjured everywhere in heaven. This is but one of numerous examples in the ancient world where they reflected on the power of statuary versus the power of words. And the consensus generally was, and I'll put a disclaimer in here, we're getting the view of wordsmiths. we're getting the rhetoricians and the poets, so biased. But the consensus view in those texts is that words and vivid description are superior because, like Homer's Zeus, that image, once you've heard it, resonates in your brain and can be carried with you everywhere. Whereas as marvellous as that feeling of standing in front of a colossal statue or a beautiful temple is, you will only have it in that place. Perhaps one of the clearest examples of this agonistic debate lies in Lucian's Imagines. In this text, two men endeavour to paint a verbal portrait of a strikingly beautiful woman recently seen by one of them. Now, to describe her, Lysinus borrows from the sculptors, and he compares each of her physical traits to examples of beauty from famous statuary and painting. Finally, however, he turns to Homer to describe her colouring, describing Homer as the best of the painters. The competitive nature of the dialogue and the sort of true competition that lies underneath, this is not just a story about a beautiful woman, becomes apparent when his friend Polystratus recognises this woman by the physical description, but insists on a description of her character to complete the picture. We might thank Polystratus for being an ancient feminist and thinking women have more than one dimension. But the response to this from his friend is, "It is no small thing, this contest you set." The conversation goes on and makes several points, but ultimately in it, Lucian defends the superiority of words on the basis of their longevity and their accuracy when compared to the more limited nature of plastic art, which can only ever capture one form, one expression, one moment in time, and will be limited in geography and space. Now, I've just given you a couple of examples, but this was a widespread topos in the ancient world and in Greco-Roman literature in particular. Plastic arts were considered to be an inferior form of representation precisely because of the limitations we've mentioned. Whereas words can transcend time and space and capture the imagination of a hearer reader in a way that allows them to access the subject matter. So what does this all mean, and how is it all relevant for the rhetoric of Revelation? Scholars generally agree that the John who wrote Revelation thinks the Christian community is facing a crisis, whether real or imagined. I'm not arguing here for some kind of systematic persecution. I think for John that crisis is about allegiance, and it's about the nature of ethical Christian living and therefore salvation. He goes to great pains in the text to portray the empire as profoundly evil, denouncing any possibility that a Christ follower can participate by trading or eating idol meat in the empire and still be faithful to Christ. And part of his rhetoric is to show idols and statuary as profoundly evil, as the kind of anti-Christs. This text is one example of how the earliest Christians negotiated life and religious allegiance in a visual culture that was often hostile to them and their claims. John needs to convince his hearers that God is present and real and more powerful than the deities they see around them. But as a self-described Jewish prophet, he cannot make his argument for God's presence by pointing to statues and images of Christ or God, not without participating in the very idolatry he decries. This rhetorical technique of vivid description offers the option of making God present in another way, bridging the gap between word and image to evoke emotions and imagination and grant the hearer an epiphanic experience of the divine. In doing so, John participates in a culture that was arguably obsessed with the representation of the gods, and one that argued vehemently over how best to represent the divine. And so in a way, he is using the very tools of culture to subvert that culture, at least in part. I think that by tapping into this commonplace, this topos, and this conversation in the wider culture, John is giving weight to his argument, to his learned readers, that words surpass images in giving knowledge of the gods, and that the true God can therefore be seen in his text. And in doing so, he addresses the needs of those communities that cry out for justice, that cry out for God's presence, arguing that God is present in their very midst. Rhetorically, he's using fear and visual rhetoric to persuade his hearers to remain faithful to Christ in their worship and practices. Later on in Revelation, these same techniques will be used pedagogically through descriptions of both judgment and the promise of New Jerusalem to kind of keep them on the straight and narrow. I started with an adage, seeing is believing. This dates back to sometime in the 18th century. It's hard to trace before that. But the full saying is, seeing is believing, but feeling's the truth. And while I'm personally not a big fan of feelings, I think this points to the power of rhetoric that we're seeing here. Thank you.
So what a great start to the day. So we've got an opportunity for questions, observations, asking for more clarifications. It's great. I was just sort of thinking how in the beginning of 1 John, it starts about what we have seen, what we have heard, and actually inviting us directly into that visual experience, the experience that has been described for us by words, leading us into the same one. So that's really fantastic. So we've got a microphone. Yes, okay, Maggie's got a question.
Thank you, Robin. Great, awesome, loved it. I was just thinking, you said, how do you make God real to those that feel that he is absent? And I'm wondering about the use of vivid language in the world of emoji.
Oh, you're asking me to address contemporary issues, Maggie. Oh, yeah, I mean, something's lost. Although emojis have their own vivid claims, don't they? I mean, you can, I don't know. What do you think? I know what I think. I mean, I think for our contemporary world, this raises interesting issues because we know that, I don't want to denigrate the visual. A beautiful church and beautiful imagery can all be profound ways of accessing the divine. But it's perhaps a reminder that we've also lost a sense of the power of speech to paint a picture and to move people, and I don't know quite what that means for a world of tweets and emojis where it's hard to tell stories in quite the same way. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you.
Though we do have the experience when we've read a book and go to see the movie, and the movie doesn't always match up to how we've imagined it.
And it's very disconcerting. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to ask you why we don't have any interpretation of the book of the Apocalypse before the 9th century or 8th or 9th century. We don't have any patristic interpretation
Of Revelation. Yeah, we have a bit of a gap. I don't know if I can tell you why, except to say that it's very clear that in some of the first few centuries, Revelation was, with a number of other texts, considered in a bit of a grey area about whether it should make it into the canon, often grouped with things like the Apocalypse of Peter, which didn't, and if you've read that book, it's a good thing it didn't. I don't have an easy answer, except that this must have disturbed in some way. If I was guessing, given the trajectory of Pauline literature that becomes, I'm painting broad brushstrokes here, but that becomes increasingly more culturally, more open to assimilating with culture, reflecting the ideals of Greco-Roman culture. So we see that in Pauline literature around praying for the emperor and, the household codes and things. And I wonder if the very sharp critique of empire in Revelation puts it at odds with that other Christian trajectory. That would be my guess.
Thank you, Robin. I really enjoyed your presentation. Especially, I really enjoy your reading Revelation from rhetorical perspective. It's a very minority here in Australia still. I'm a big fan of that.
Thank you.
And also, just my question to you is that if you read Revelation from the forensic setting, then have you ever thought about who is the accuser or accused or jury or judge, something like that? That's a big issue when you read the Revelation and then accusing somebody else outside or Roman authorities or something else. That's I think to me is a really important question to ask.
Yes, it is, and we should talk more about that. I mean, on the whole, I think there are these forensic traces clearly in Revelation. I think on the whole, I would want to call this deliberative rhetoric. But we clearly have some courtroom imagery, and I think in the mouths of the martyrs, we have accusations and cries for vengeance and justice. I mean, a cry for justice is a constant thread in the book, along with this witnessing language, which is part of that forensic echo. Where I'd put the emphasis, I'd need to think about a bit more. I think for me that I'd put the emphasis on deliberative because it's ultimately about ethical living in that space, and the judgment is left up to the divine. But I need to think about that a bit more.
On the patristic thing, it depends which patristics you're looking at.
Yes.
I mean, it's a big issue for Papias, big issue for Irenaeus, big issue for Augustine. The issue is Western and Eastern.
Okay.
I think in the Western tradition you get quite a strong patristic interest in this. You got Origen, of course, also very involved in this question of millenarianism, Eusebius. So there's a pretty hefty discussion in those early centuries about Revelation.
True. Thank you, Frank. That's helpful. Oh, hi. Hi, Mary.
Okay, thanks, Robin. Thanks for your paper. Robin, you spoke primarily of the Greco-Roman background. You mentioned a little bit the Jewish in terms of negotiating that Roman world, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about the Jewish background. Are you presuming the audience is primarily Gentile? What sort of thoughts you might have about that, please?
Yep. I'm going to sound very sitting on the fence here and say I think this is such a hybrid document that we cannot actually say it's more Jewish or it's more Greco-Roman. It's very clear the author is steeped in the Hebrew Bible tradition. That's where the majority, but not all, of the images come from. He sees himself in that prophetic line. And in a way we couldn't understand the text without that context. But I mean, one example is the image of evil, which is given these sort of fourfold terms of ancient dragon, serpent, beast, Satan, diabolos. I mean, right there in the way evil is described, you've got a fusing of Jewish and Greek, Hebrew and Greek terms, and I think that's what he just does throughout. We cannot tease them apart. So in that sense, I mean, we know this, right? That talking about whether someone's a Jew or Greek So in terms of his community, I think it could be mixed. Yeah. And I would put this text at least into the 90s, so we've already got second and third generation Christ followers, so we may be seeing an increasingly Gentile community.
I want to come back to emojis. So one of the things that interested me about the question is that it seems like emojis blur the distinction between language and image. So they can be arranged in sentences. They're images that speak and communicate. It seems like, if I've understood you, ekphrasis blurs the distinction between language and image from the other direction. So there are words that show. They function imagistically. So the question is, what does your account of ekphrasis in Revelation, how does that reflect on the unease that many Christians have had about representing the divine? So often this has been located in the anxiety about physical depictions of the divine, statuary images. But if words function imagistically in the way that you're describing, then it seems like Christians, as many have, ought to worry about representing the divine in language. So this is the sharpest version of the question. I think I heard you say that John is saying that God is seen in his text. Does that mean that the book of Revelation is an idol?
It's an icon. Within the text itself, he uses different words for image, and there's clearly a distinction between idol, which is always bad, and icon or image, which is a more positive thing. So even within the text, there's a sense of good and bad images. But I think your question is interesting. What ekphrasis does is it imitates the visual sense. It harnesses that power. I'm conscious as a Protestant, we have a long tradition of being very suspicious of the visual, and we could maybe agree with John that it's inferior, but it's not to say it's always bad. And I don't think I think he actually, it's a bit of have your cake and eat it too. I think he wants to evoke, because he recognises it as powerful, the very thing that he is critiquing. So in the vision of the whore of Babylon in chapter 17, he gazes at her in amazement. There's a deep recognition that these images are powerful and actually quite seductive. So he's trying to harness that power. Whether he actually does it entirely successfully is an interesting question in terms of where that line is between what he critiques and what he does himself. I haven't really answered your question, but sorry.
Thanks, Rob. That was great. Back to the rhetoric question. The other thing that occurs to me is, as well as the forensic accusation defence mode, this seems to relate directly to the possibilities that epidictic rhetoric offers in a rhetoric of praise and blame.
Yes.
One of the standard genres where that form of rhetoric was used was the funeral oration,
yes,
where the description of the dead person was a way of making the dead person alive for the audience in a significant way. So two questions really. First of all, are there Greco-Roman sources that enable us to say that ekphrasis is happening in some of those locations? And secondly, does that help us to understand why there is this focus in Revelation, as in Paul? I'm thinking Galatians 3:1, I publicly portrayed Jesus as crucified before your eyes. The notion that the description of the lamb who was slaughtered, the dead Christ, the description of the dead person is a way of actually making Jesus alive for the audience.
Yes, the slaughtered lamb and some of those very strong images, I think, are a way of making the image alive, the slaughtered lamb that is standing. I don't have the references off the top of my head, but we do have both actual, what we would call a eulogy from funerals and descriptions of funerals. I'm more familiar with the ones that actually describe some of the more wondrous aspects of an emperor's funeral, where we get these descriptions of eagles flying up to heaven and other attestations to the soul of the emperor rising. So they're performing a different rhetorical function, but they exist. And interestingly, in Revelation, in chapter 18, that whole sort of fall of Babylon could be seen as a kind of inverted funeral oration. So those elements are definitely there. I'm conscious of time. Are we into...
We've got 3 minutes and 3 questions.
Because, I don't want to keep people from morning tea.
Darn, the pressure's on. I partly want to return to the issue of the idol and the icon, because, of course, that's going to raise all kinds of interesting issues about criteria. I wonder there if it's not so much the nature of representation, but the singularity of any form of representation that's the issue. But I can tease that out later. What might be missing, I wonder, even in this text, the Johannine text, is a certain way of treating the reader as a particular kind of moral subject. So here I'm thinking about the performance of, say, for instance, Plato's anti-sophistry works, which reconstrues reason and the imagination in quite a different way by compelling the reader that engages her as a rational agent. And there's something quite different then that's going on with this type of vivid text.
While Chris moves, I need to think. I think it is very different to the Plato's text. I don't even know if it's in the mind of this author to think in those terms, to be honest. But there are other parts. So in between the visions, which do dominate, there are epistolary parts and other sort of ethical exhortations that might fit better with the assumption of a rational agent. I do think this author thinks that there is, it's not quite the same thing, but there is individual responsibility as well as communal. Like there is a choice. So in that sense, there's a moral agency that in fact, a large point of the text is, I think, to mitigate against a kind of defeatist notion that you can't do anything and these powers are too strong, but actually there is a choice, even in a kind of passive's the wrong word. The readers are never called into action. They're actually called into allegiance and non-participation. And yeah.
Well, this is in connection with the previous question, since you mentioned that Revelation itself is the revelation to John, not revelation of John. And he started off with seeing a vision. My question is, does he really have freedom in what words to use and what image to use, when in fact he was just being shown of what's happening?
Yep. There's been a bit of debate about this, how much Revelation reflects a kind of ecstatic experience, because when you read it, it can feel a little crazy. The more time I spend with Revelation, the more I think it is incredibly carefully crafted as a piece of literature. So that's not to say that there wasn't a genuine visionary experience that lies behind it, but I think what we have received is a carefully crafted accounting of that, and that these images from the vision, and we can see that in each of the churches that then get addressed in chapters 2 and 3 picks up a different image from this vision. So the literary threads are very clear.
Witness to our last question now.
Thank you for the interesting lecture. You spoke of the Greco-Roman influence on the writer and the text. How about the Jewish? Especially John lived in that period of time when there was a lot of apocalyptic literature, and also the Jewish imagery in the text. And the whole book of Revelation we can find a lot of Jewish imagery, incense, sacrifice, high priests, and etc. So I think you spoke of the Greek-Roman influence. How about the Jewish influence of on the?
Assuming the Jewish influence is there, John is drawing on what he would have thought of as the scriptures, which is the Old Testament, and much of the image comes from there. I do think this book was written in Greek, and that means he's had a Greek education, and by virtue of having any kind of Greek education in Asia Minor, we know that he was introduced to these rhetorical exercises. So we've got, we've got someone who whose schooling is possibly quite Greek, whose cultural background is incredibly Jewish, and it's definitely there. I'm pressing more on the Greco-Roman today, but that's not to say the Jewish imagery is not there. It is so there that we can't ignore. It's steeped in it. It's everywhere. Yep. So I'm not meaning. I'm not emphasising it today, but that's not. It's throughout this text very strongly. Yep. And I think John would actually call himself a Jew. A Jew who believes Christ is the Messiah, but we don't yet have this Christian language. I think he would consider himself a faithful Jew, and this is what faithful Judaism looks like at this point for those who think Christ is the Messiah. So, yeah.
Thank you, Robin. I think we'd just like to congratulate you for a very stimulating presentation and great start to the day.